lived in Canada my whole life, was born and raised in a small rural town on the eastern side of the country, had absolutely no intentions of being a minister in my life. And I was a church organist. My first profession is, at one time, I was a semi-professional musician, certainly not there anymore, and made a living teaching children piano lessons, which was 70 kids a week, twinkle, twinkle, little star. It doesn't matter how good they are. That's just way too much twinkle, twinkle, little star. And I was a church organist on the weekends, born and raised in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, always had a strong faith and also a strong practical side. My parents are not clergy, but were always heavily involved, took their position in the church seriously, they were never what you'd call the Sunday morning pew sitter. They were always actively involved. And so I was just raised in that kind of environment. And when my music skills got to a point where I was proficient enough, I soon found myself being called upon in that capacity. I always assumed that would be my capacity. And yet the good Lord had other plans. As I say, I was very fortunate early on to be able to, I wouldn't say dabble, to play a bit and experiment. I had a congregation that was probably my favorite, just because I could do no wrong. And I did lots of wrong, but they were so gracious. They let me experiment with styles of ministry. I grew up in a small town in rural Ontario where the old style of church had long since died out. You know, I call it the apple pie ministry, where fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of church runs on the underground and the gossip line and the families and the communities and those relationships in small towns. And a lot of our churches here in Canada have kind of just pushed that aside and say, you know, we're past that stage. Well, we are, but the relationship principles are what we're losing in our churches. And of course, I think COVID has really sort of just torn the Band-Aid off the fact that we have a serious problem with maintaining, building trustful relationships between preacher and congregation and between pew sitter and pew sitter. In terms of COVID, that's sort of has hit us right between the knees because we've taken a congregation where we were, like, the youngest person is probably 55 and it goes up to 95 or more. That's the congregation I serve. And you go from having over 100 on a Sunday morning to nothing for 6 months because we were in lockdown here, according to British Columbia parameters. And we've opened up, but there's a huge fear. And so you've got a fear of what we've been through, a fear of stepping out for fear of, you know, inadvertently making ourselves ill, and a greater fear now in British Columbia. We are now moving into dangerous levels of round 2. And so there's this sense of being lost. And some of my coursework over the summer was looking at Old Testament metaphors and layering them over top of COVID. Things like wilderness experiences, Exodus, being in exile, a promised land, you know, there it is, no, it's not. There it is, no, it's not. So there's just all this uncertainty and all that solid ground that we feel we've on. These are people, for the most part, who've been faithful churchgoers their entire life. Now, to say, have they been spiritually deep in those years? I wouldn't necessarily say that. But one of the things that COVID has done in amongst this whole wilderness experience is forced all of us, but particularly the seniors, to look at their spiritual life and re-examine it. And on a milder level, that's what I was starting to see happen with the congregation before COVID. People coming in desiring something new or something different, not just from their church, but from their God, from their faith, from their spirituality. What I'm finding religion is helpful for right now is it is one of those things with technology that we can continue to be there every Sunday. Either if we can't be in person, we can be online. It's not the same. And we acknowledge that. This is not quite what you're used to, but it's something. And it's steady. It's every Sunday you would come to church, or every Sunday you would go say your prayers, or would, so that's important. The trustfulness, the calmness, and a re-examination of the steadfastness of God. The Moses story was in the lectionary this summer in the Old Testament. So I simply threw, isn't this awful? I threw all the Old Testament or New Testament stuff out, and we just did this long, quiet journey with Moses every week, one step further along, one step. And it felt like we were journeying through COVID by journeying with Moses, because Moses keeps running into all these roadblocks and setbacks, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And there was, and also the fact that we continued with the same story week after week, but it was a new part of the story. It didn't become old or boring. It felt like we were journeying together, not only biblically, but also being able to layer the COVID metaphor on top of that. And finding that at the end of the journey, God was as steadfast and faithful with Moses, despite all the ups and downs, as he had been back at the burning bush at the very beginning. And that kept that quiet sense of hope very much alive without having to speak too heavily about it. I'm a real advocate that we don't need nice people in the pulpit anymore. Isn't that an awful thing to say? We need passionate people